thanks very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. As I said, I would rather be in St Andrews, but here I am in Sussex. So in this paper, basically, I'm trying to make sense of the notion of concept revision. So the notion of concept revision plays a central role in accounts of conceptual engineering. But I think that sometimes when people talk about concept revision, the concepts in question can't really be revised. So what I'm going to do is provide something like a taxonomy of kinds of concepts categorized by a number of different properties that I think concepts can have. And then I'll talk about the relation between the having of those properties and the possibility for genuine concept revision. And it is a work in progress, under construction. Okay, so here's the plan. First, I'll provide an overview of a metasemantic framework that I've set out elsewhere. Some of you will be familiar with this, but since I assume not everyone is, and because it's important for what I'm going to say later, I'll start with that. It's an externalist framework, and it involves three key notions, those of meanings, concepts, and conceptions. So I'll explain a little bit about each of those. Of the three, I take concepts to be fundamental. And this comes out in two contrasts that I want to highlight. The first is in the difference between concepts and meanings, specifically with respect to truth and normativity. And the second is in the difference between concepts and conceptions, specifically with respect to their different explanatory roles. So I'll talk about those as well. Concepts, I think, fall into different categories depending on various properties they have. So in particular, I'm going to talk about a concept's direction of determination, its modal range, and its temporal range. And then I'll talk about the implications of those three properties for a concept's eligibility for revision. And finally, I'll tie it into a broader discussion of conceptual engineering at the end. Okay, so I'll start with a common assumption, namely the assumption that the semantic content of a sentence is the same as the propositional content of the thought it expresses. So for example, the semantic content of the sentence, tigers have stripes, is typically understood as the proposition that tigers have stripes, which proposition is also typically taken to provide the content of the thought the sentence expresses. So semantic contents and thought contents are commonly identified. And at the level of words rather than at the level of sentences or thoughts, the common assumption is that the term meaning and the term concept are harmlessly interchangeable, perhaps even synonymous. And that's evident in the widespread practice amongst philosophers of switching back and forth between the two, often within a single sentence. So I reject both of those claims. I think terms have linguistic meanings, and I think that they express concepts, but I think that meanings and concepts should not be identified. Meanings and concepts are distinct representational elements, and a single word or expression will be associated with one of each. So a single word will have a meaning, and it will also express a concept. And what I'm going to do now is tell you something about meanings and concepts. Okay. So I'll start with linguistic meaning. I take meaning to be determined by patterns of use and deference across the community. The meaning of a predicative term in particular, so they're my primary interest, the predicative terms. The meaning of predicative terms reflects the community's current received account of the subject matter. By subject matter, I mean something quite weak, so that the subject matter of the term tigers is tigers, and the subject matter of the term hipster is hipsters, and so on. You don't need to be a robust realist about the subject matter. Thinking of meaning in terms of subject matter reflects the idea that meaning is determined in the context of relational contextual applications to things in the world. So language is used in application to instances in the world in the primary instance. And it also ties in to Quine's claim that there's no separating truths of meaning from matters of fact, which I think is right. So meaning then, as it says on the slide, is based in agreement, broadly speaking, with the opinions of the most competent carrying the most weight. And here I take the notion of competence quite broadly, and I prefer to talk in terms of competence rather than in terms of deference to experts. So a lot of the literature in externalism talks about deference to experts. I think talk of competence is better for a number of reasons. So for one thing, I think talk of experts conflates two separate ideas. One, of an expert as someone who is in the best epistemic position relative to other epistemic agents, and the other of an expert as someone who's in the best epistemic position relative to the facts, that is, as someone who knows. So by an expert, typically, we mean someone who is in the best epistemic position relative to other epistemic agents. It's the person who we think knows the most. And that conforms with our actual linguistic practice. But of course, an epistemic agent, in that sense, the person who's in the best epistemic position relative to other people, is clearly not necessarily someone who actually knows. So I think that notion of an expert conflates the two ideas, and I think that can be damaging in the literature. For another thing, talk of experts implies that patterns of deference just flow in one direction. So it assumes that basically the pattern of deference flows from the non-experts to the experts. Whereas I think that, again, is misleading. I think deference is more fluid, with the most competent speakers themselves always open to the possibility of being challenged and corrected, precisely because they need not be experts in the fact-knowing sense. Okay. This is obviously an externalist account of linguistic meaning, because an individual's use of a term doesn't determine that meaning. And it follows that the linguistic meaning of a term, this is the last point on the slide, the linguistic meaning of a term can be stable across a community of people whose individual uses differ. Just a quick note on widespread variation in people's use of terms. I think that the extent of the variation in individual use is often underestimated in theories of meaning. It's put to one side as if it's unusual or as if it's an anomaly or it only occurs with young children. But I think that seriously underestimates the widespread variation in our epistemic perspectives on the world, where that widespread variation in our epistemic perspectives on the world grounds our variations in our use of language. I think the variation across individual uses is actually quite large. Okay, finally, note that linguistic meaning is messy because practice is messy. So linguistic meaning can change over time, meanings can be contested, there can be no settled meaning for a term at a given time, and so on. And all of that matches up to the messiness of linguistic practice. So I'm quite happy with that. All right, that's an externalist account of meaning and hence of language. And here's an externalist account of concepts and hence of thought. The concept expressed by a term is individuated fundamentally by relations between a thinker and objective properties in her world. And we can think here of the classic twin earth cases with respect to concepts such as gold and water and tiger. So concepts are externally individuated by relations between thinkers and their surrounding environment. And that contrasts with meanings, which are grounded in use and practice and agreement. It also contrasts with conceptions, which are roughly sets of associated beliefs. This means that just as meaning can be stable across a community of people whose individual uses differ, a concept can be stable across a community of people who have different associated individual conceptions, different beliefs. And again, the twin earth cases illustrate the point. So Alf and his doctor have the very same concept, arthritis, despite having different associated conceptions. And similarly, Oscar in 1750 and the scientists in 2020 are also assumed to have the same concept, water, despite having different associated conceptions. So beliefs can vary even though the concepts don't vary, and individual use can vary despite the fact that the meaning of a term doesn't vary. So both linguistic meanings and concepts can be stable across a community of people who use a term slightly differently and have different associated beliefs. But, and here's the crucial point, a concept can also be stable across different communities who have different communal or collective associated conceptions. And this marks a fundamental difference between linguistic meaning on the one hand and concepts on the other. So as a rough approximation, the communal conception, the collective conception that the community has as a whole, just is the linguistic meaning of the term. That might not be quite right, but it's a close approximation. So if community A and community B have different communal conceptions, then they mean different things by a given term, but they could nonetheless be expressing the same concept because each community might have agreed on a different account, different characterization of the very same subject matter. After all, just as individual conceptions can be wrong, communal conceptions can also be wrong. We can go wrong individually and we can go wrong collectively. So here's the main point, and this is the final point on this slide. While linguistic meaning is determined by agreement, by patterns of deference across a linguistic practice, concepts are, in certain cases at least, determined by relations to the facts. And clearly an agreed account or characterization of a subject matter doesn't have to be a true account or characterization of the subject matter. So that means that the linguistic meaning of a term is not generally identical to the concept it expresses. Okay, so the difference between linguistic meaning and concepts comes out when we relate the discussion to questions of truth and normativity. So linguistic meaning is determined by agreement within a community, given the patterns of deference and so on, and deference to the most competent. Whereas concepts can, at least in certain cases, transcend any such agreement. Linguistic meaning tracks a community's understanding of a subject matter, where concepts are, at least in certain cases, determined independently of a community's specific understanding of the subject matter. And this means that linguistic norms are really norms of appropriate assertion. They provide norms for correcting individual use relative to the wider linguistic practice, which helps to promote uniformity in use and helps to promote communication, but they're grounded in agreement, they're not grounded in truth. Conceptual norms, in contrast, can transcend linguistic practice and are sometimes grounded in truth. To illustrate this, consider the following example, which is on the slide. The sentence, "Whales are mammals," would have contravened the linguistic norms of appropriate assertion in 1700, but once we separate linguistic norms to do with conformity within a practice from norms of thought, which have to do with truth, we can acknowledge that although it would have violated the norms of appropriate assertion in 1700, it nonetheless expressed a true thought. Truth is not determined by agreement, as I said. This means there's a way in which we ought to use a term given the practice of our linguistic community, but there's also a way in which we ought to use certain terms that goes beyond the practice of our linguistic community. And just as I take thought to be more fundamental than language, I take the norms of thought to be more fundamental than linguistic norms. The distinction between meaning and thought also opens up a corresponding distinction between analytic truths on the one hand and conceptual truths on the other. Analyticity is best understood as a linguistic matter and is associated with linguistic norms grounded in practice, whereas conceptual truths are associated with norms of thought that transcend a given community's practice. And as such, a statement is analytic only relative to a linguistic practice, but conceptual truths, in contrast, are necessary truths. In effect, on this account, the analytic truths are at least sometimes expressions of what we think the conceptual truths are, of what we take the conceptual truths to be. So they're our best attempt at getting the conceptual truths right. And this distinction between analytic truths and conceptual truths allows us to retain a notion of analyticity, as well as a notion of necessity, while analytic statements, while nonetheless accommodating Quine's insight that no statement is immune to revision. Analytic statements can and will change over time as the meaning of our terms change, but that doesn't mean the conceptual truths will change, clearly. Okay, so having said something about the difference between meanings and concepts with regard to truth and normativity, I'll now say something about the different explanatory roles of concepts and conceptions. If we think of examples of concepts such as tiger, gold, and water, we can see that the role of concepts of that kind is to secure reference. Concepts provide representational anchors to the world in a broadly theory transcendent way. So our theory about gold can vary, even though we're still thinking about gold. This means they can provide stability through theory change and hence provide stability through linguistic change. The linguistic meaning of a term, since it's grounded in use, can change over time, but crucially, that won't necessitate a change in the concept expressed, since it's possible to have a single concept associated with different meanings at different times, or associated with different meanings by different communities. For the same reason, concepts make substantive disagreement possible, and they make the avoidance of conceptual relativism possible. So a change in the practice surrounding the term tiger, let's say, would constitute a change in linguistic meaning, since meaning depends on use, but that's consistent with the terms expressing a single concept, tiger, both before and after the change in linguistic practice, so long as the concept is determined in part by relations to tigers. Okay. Individual conceptions, in contrast, this is specifically individual conceptions I'm thinking of here, not collective or communal conceptions. individual conceptions explain and rationalise individual behaviour. Internalist theories of concepts prioritise this role in their understanding of concepts, of course. So according to internalist theories, an individual's concepts are determined by her individual perceptual discriminatory capacities and her inferential dispositions. So in short, for the internalist, a concept is determined by how the individual is disposed to behave. So internalist theories are tailor-made to provide an account of individual behaviour. That's what drives them. But that's no reason to favour internalist theories, since the externalist can also explain and rationalise individual behaviour. And in my framework, it's individual conceptions that play that role. Moreover, the externalist account is preferable, I think, because we don't just need to explain and rationalise behaviour. We also need to secure joint reference, and we need to make sense of normativity that transcends agreement. And I've argued in other places that I don't think the internalist can do that. But all we need to note for now is that the externalist distinction between concepts and conceptions allows us to do both. So both concepts and conceptions are needed, I think, and the internalist's mistake is to conflate the two. Note also that although externalist conceptions play the same role as internalist concepts in the sense of explaining and rationalising individual behaviour, they're very different kinds of things. Externalist conceptions are, after all, composed of externally individuated concepts. So conceptions are themselves externally individuated, whereas they're not for the internalist. And concepts, rather than conceptions, are, I think, the fundamental representational elements. Okay, so that's the basic picture involving meanings, concepts, and conceptions. And I've said a little bit about each of those so that you can understand how the basic framework is set up. And what I'm going to do now is distinguish a number of different properties that I think concepts can have. And specifically, I'm going to look at direction of determination, modal range, and temporal range. And then I'll look, as I said before, at the implications of those three properties for a concept's eligibility for revision. Okay, so I'm going to start with a concept's direction of determination. Some concepts have what I call a world to mind direction of determination. So concepts such as tiger, water, gold, and so on depend on the nature of the phenomenon to which they refer. They don't depend on our conceptions, either individual or collective. That's what makes them world to mind concepts. We could all be wrong about the nature of tigers and yet still possess the concept tiger, and we could all be wrong about the nature of water and yet still possess the concept water. Other concepts have what I call a mind to world direction of determination. So for example, concepts such as game and juice seem to depend essentially on our conceptions. It's not that games and juice aren't real things, obviously they are. It's just that what counts as a game or as juice seems to depend entirely on how we collectively use the terms. So if community A uses the term juice just for fruit juice and community B uses the term juice for any kind of soft drink, including lemonade and Coke, then they just mean different things by the word juice, and they're also talking about different things, albeit with some overlap in the extension. The concepts expressed by these kinds of terms, the mind to world concepts, seem not to go beyond our collective conceptions and hence not to go beyond their meanings, precisely because there seem to be no independent properties that we're trying to characterize. No doubt we're driven by practical considerations to group certain things together, but there seems to be no right or wrong in the practice beyond the right and wrong of particular individual uses relative to the communal practice as a whole. There's no substantive disagreement between the two communities that I laid out. There's just two different uses of the term juice, each with its own meaning and each with its own application, and they're both just fine. Now, it doesn't really matter for my purposes whether you agree with me on a specific example. So you might disagree about particular examples. Maybe you're a hardcore realist about games, I don't know. The distinction can be drawn purely in general terms, and then which concepts fall into which category, so which concepts count as mind to world or world to mind, can be taken as a further matter. So a concept with a world to mind direction of determination is, by definition, one which is determined by objective properties about which we might be collectively mistaken, whereas a concept with a mind to world direction of determination is, by definition, one which is determined by our practice And this means that any concept with a mind-to-world direction of determination will be such that a change in the associated communal conceptions, the collective conception, will not only result in the term having a different meaning, but will also result in the term expressing a different concept. Okay. So just as concepts can differ with respect to their direction of determination, they can also differ with respect to their modal range. All concepts with a mind-to-world direction of determination are what I'll call practice-bound. For what I hope are obvious reasons, they're determined by our linguistic practice. Of the concepts with a world-to-mind direction of determination, however, some are what I call world-bound and others are world-invariant. So concepts such as tiger, gold and water are world-bound concepts in the sense that they refer to objective properties that are instantiated in some possible worlds but not in others. So there's water here but not on Twin Earth, there's twin water on Twin Earth but not here. That means world-bound concepts are only available to thinkers in some possible worlds but not others. You might think you've got the concept twin water, but actually you don't. It's a dummy predicate in my view. World-bound concepts are all subject to twin Earth thought experiments because they refer to kinds which have epistemic counterparts, indistinguishable lookalikes. So water and twin water are epistemic counterparts for Oscar and twin Oscar. And obviously the notion of an epistemic counterpart is subject relative and time relative. It depends on your epistemic position in the world. So those concepts, the world-bound concepts, the ones that vary from world to world or are only available to thinkers in some possible worlds, contrast with the world-invariant concepts. So the world-invariant concepts are potentially available in any possible world, and that's because they refer to properties which are in some sense accessible in all possible worlds. World-invariant concepts are thus not subject to twin Earth thought experiments, and we can say that world-invariant concepts provide conceptual fixed points. Again, you don't need to agree with me on the particular examples because I've just characterised the distinction between world-bound concepts and world-invariant concepts in purely general terms. But I do think that normative concepts are world-invariant, and I think that normative concepts, as a result, provide conceptual fixed points. I don't want to say that only normative concepts provide conceptual fixed points. So I think mathematical concepts are also world invariant and provide conceptual fixed points. But I do want to say I think that all normative concepts are world invariant. Whether or not you think these are normative concepts, I also think concepts like truth, belief, knowledge and person are world invariant. But again, we can disagree about the cases. Okay, so in this context, I should say something about moral twin Earth. Hopefully the setup of moral twin Earth is relatively familiar to you. My claim that normative concepts are world invariant, that they provide conceptual fixed points, appears to be undermined by the moral twin Earth scenario, which runs as follows. Moral twin Earth is a place just like Earth, and in particular, the term right, as in morally right, has the same normative role on moral twin Earth as it does on Earth. But we're to suppose that earthling uses of right, which I've subscripted right subscript E, are uniquely causally regulated by the natural property maximising pleasure, while twin earthling uses of right subscript TE, are uniquely causally regulated by the natural property treating no one as a mere means. So you've got a difference between a consequentialist approach and a deontological approach in the Earth and twin Earth, moral twin Earth respectively. And then it looks as if it's right in the Earth sense of right to push the one man onto the tracks in front of the trolley to save the many, because that would maximise happiness. But it looks as if it's not right in the sense of twin Earth right to do so, because that would be to treat the one man that was pushed as a mere means. And the worry is that an externalist semantics, combined with a naturalist account of moral properties or normative properties more generally, seems to show that moral terms and hence some normative terms are world-bound rather than world-invariant. However, once we separate meanings from concepts and concepts from conceptions, we see that even in the face of the moral twin Earth setup, there is a way to reject the claim that moral concepts might vary from world to world, and instead retain the claim that I want to hold on to, that normative moral concepts are world invariant and provide conceptual fixed points. So appeal to the distinction between meanings and concepts and the corresponding concept-conception distinction provides a way out. After all, it's consistent with different patterns in actual use that right subscript E and right subscript TE express the same moral concept, but have different associated communal conceptions. So they might have different meanings, but it doesn't follow that they express different concepts. And the important question, given my externalist framework, is not the descriptive question of how the terms are applied on Earth and moral twin Earth, which we're supposing is different, but the normative question of how the terms ought to be applied given the nature of the moral properties in question. And it might be the same in both cases. So an externalist metasemantic framework of the kind I provided is consistent with normative concepts being world invariant and providing conceptual fixed points. You might not like that view, you might not buy into it, but we do have a kind of consistency between the strong world invariant nature of normative concepts, in my view. To undermine that claim that normative concepts are world invariant and provide conceptual fixed points, what would be needed is a reason to think that the moral properties differ from world to world, where that reason is not based merely on the claim that the use of moral terms might differ, because difference in the use of moral terms is not sufficient to establish a difference in the moral properties referred to. Okay. Matty Eklund has provided a broader consideration against the claim I'm defending, that normative concepts are world invariant, and this is a quote from his 2017 book, Choosing Normative Concepts. There's a linguistic community speaking a language much like English, except for the following differences. While their words good, right, and ought are associated with the same normative role as our words, good, right, and ought, their words aren't coextensive with our words good, right, and ought. So even if they're exactly right about what is good, right, and ought to be done in their sense, they do not seek to promote what is good, right, and ought to be done. So then it looks as if we're faced with the further question, which normative concepts ought we to use, theirs or ours? But again, appeal to the distinction between meanings and concepts and the corresponding concept-conception distinction provides a way out. But it might help at this point for me to say something about extensions and reference, given that a key element of the alternative setup, as Matty has it, is the claim that the extensions of the alternative terms differ from the extensions of our terms. So since a word has two representational elements, on my view, a meaning and also a concept, it will have two extensions associated, one associated with the meaning and the other associated with the concept. In certain cases, they may coincide, but in certain cases, they won't. That might sound a bit odd, but here's how it works, and this is on the slide. The extension of the meaning of a term is the set of things which satisfies the descriptive characterization of the subject matter that's arrived at by agreement and that reflects the actual practice of the linguistic community. The extension of a concept, in contrast, is the set of things that instantiate the property to which the concept refers. And like I said, they may come apart. So the extension of a term's meaning is determined by agreement, grounded in practice, whereas the extension of a concept is, at least in certain cases, determined in a practice transcendent way as the set of things that instantiate the property to which the concept refers. Reference is here the fundamental notion. Moreover, I think properties are more fine-grained than extensions, so the two concepts can have the same extension while referring to different properties. So the term trilateral and the term triangular might have the same extension, but they refer to different properties, on my view. But that doesn't really matter. The important point here is that alternative, that situation alternative that's been set up, states that the extension of the term right in our linguistic community is different from the extension of the term right in the alternative linguistic community, because the respective use of the terms differs. And that means that the sense in which the extension of our terms and the extension of the alternative terms differ should be understood as a difference in the extensions of the linguistic meaning, precisely because it's based in use. But that's consistent with my claim that the concepts are identical and that normative concepts are world invariant. So what look to be further questions about which normative concepts we ought to use can then be understood simply as further questions about which conceptions of the same normative properties we ought to have. So neither moral twin earth nor alternative undermines the claim that normative concepts are world invariant and that they provide conceptual fixed points. Once again, to undermine that claim, what would be needed is a reason to think that the normative properties themselves differ from world to world, where that reason is not based merely on the claim that the use of normative terms might differ from world to world, because again, a difference in the use of the terms is not sufficient to establish a difference in the referent. Okay, so what I've said so far has certain implications for a concept's eligibility for revision. I've said that concepts with a world to mind direction of determination are either world bound or world invariant, but in neither case is it possible for such concepts to be revised. Alleged revisions are really, in these cases, just revisions to associated conceptions. So they're revisions to the way we understand the property, they're not revisions to the concept that refers to the property. And that's because these concepts are determined by their reference. They're the world to mind concepts. Just to be clear, obviously, I think there can be conceptual revisions involving these kinds of concepts. So over time, we do make changes to our conceptual schemes, our theoretical frameworks, and we do this when we introduce a new concept, often in response to the discovery of a new aspect of the world. There's a whole range of concepts across the sciences, as well as in philosophy and elsewhere, that we now have that we didn't have 100 years ago. That's fine. We also make conceptual revisions when we eliminate an old concept from our conceptual theoretical framework, often in response to the fact that the concept doesn't actually refer to a property that we thought it did, or it isn't sufficiently explanatory and so on. Phlogiston is an obvious example in the philosophical literature. That's all fine too. And of course, we make conceptual revisions when we introduce subcategories for concepts, which I think we do quite a lot. So we can think here of examples like jade, and then introducing the subcategories jadeite and nephrite, epistemic warrant, and then introducing the subcategories of justifications and entitlements, necessity, and then introducing subcategories of logical necessity, metaphysical necessity, epistemic necessity, and so on. All of those kinds of revisions are a fundamental part of theoretical and conceptual change. But while all of those cases involve the introduction and elimination of concepts, and some of them involve revising the meanings of terms, none of them involve the actual genuine revision of a particular concept. You're either introducing new concepts or getting rid of old ones. So, okay, so that's the world to mind concepts. What about concepts with a mind to world direction of determination? Mind to world concepts are, as I said, practice bound. And if we think of the kinds of concepts with mind to world directions of determination that I've mentioned so far, so game, salad, and juice, and so on, it doesn't seem possible for these concepts to be revised either. A change in practice surrounding the use of a term results in a change in linguistic meaning. But since there's no independent referent to which these concepts are anchored, the inevitable result is that a change in meaning amounts to a change in concept. So now it looks as if no concept is eligible for revision, like genuine revision. But that's not quite right. And this takes us on to the further property that concepts can have, or with respect to which they can vary, and this is their temporal range. So just as world to mind concepts differ with respect to their modal range, and hence subdivide into those which are world bound and those which are world invariant, concepts with mind to world directions of determination differ with respect to what I'm calling their temporal range. And what I mean by this is that some mind to world concepts are determined entirely by the practice of a community at that time, while others, despite being practice bound, are not, for reasons that I'll get to in a minute. So concepts such as game, salad, and juice are what I've called time-bound concepts. They're determined by the collective conceptions of a community at the time, at a specific moment in time. Which concept is expressed by these terms will therefore change as the collective conceptions and the practice change, and such concepts cannot obviously be separated from the linguistic meanings of the relevant terms. But there are other practice-bound concepts that are not determined by the practice or the conceptions of a community at that time. Instead, these concepts refer to entities that have a status that's semi-independent of the practices that initially grounded them. And these concepts are what I've called externally anchored concepts. They're anchored to a specific embodiment of a practice that's been externalized, for example, by being written down as law or by being dictated by custom. And concepts such as marriage and immigrant are externally anchored concepts in this sense. We've externalized them because we have laws and practice customs surrounding these kinds of terms. Okay, so what is externalized is the embodiment of the practice at the time of the externalization. And what counts as a marriage is determined by what the law says counts as a marriage, set down at a moment in time when a certain conception was, for whatever reason, dominant. Who counts as an immigrant is determined by what the law says is an immigrant, set down at a moment in time when a certain conception was, for whatever reason, dominant, and so on. And the idea is that once a practice has been externalized by being written down as law or embedded as a custom, it takes on an existence which is independent of the practice or conception that initially generated it. So it gets a kind of external anchor for the concept that refers to it. But once the referent of a concept has been externalized in that way, not only can the referent, so the property of marriage and the property of being an immigrant and so on, remain fixed through a change in collective associated conceptions, but the concept can too. And in this sense, externally anchored concepts are like world to mind concepts in the specific sense that there can be different conceptions associated with the same concept, precisely because there's an externally anchored, because the concept is externally anchored by having this institution that's been set up. And that means that individuals' conceptions can vary, of course, but also crucially, once you have an externally anchored concept, the collective conceptions of the community can change from one particular time to another, and yet still be associated with the very same concept, even though it's a practice-bound concept. So even though it's a mind-to-world concept, the conceptions can vary and the concept not vary because the referent of the concept has been externalized from a given practice at a particular moment. And it's these externally anchored concepts that I think occupy a middle ground between the world to mind concepts, which are determined by their reference, which are independent of our conceptions of them, and the time-bound concepts, which are determined by the practice of a community at the time. So for these cases, the externally anchored cases, genuine concept revision is, I think, possible. Externally anchored concepts can remain fixed through a change in collective associated conceptions, but a change in the collective associated conceptions can lead to a call for change in the nature of the referent. And if there's a change in the nature of the referent, then perhaps there's a change in the concept itself. And these cases then potentially allow for genuine concept revision. Okay, so this marks out a class of concepts which are called special cases. These are the concepts which have mind-to-world directions of determination. They're practice-bound, but they're nonetheless externally anchored. And such concepts have reference which we're able to change because we can change the laws or customs that ground the externalized referent. They often have moral implications, which provide special reasons to revise them. And it's worth noting here that the external anchor, the setting up of the institution, if you like, doesn't even need to reflect the collective conceptions at the time it was externalized, at the time of introduction. That's because the externalization doesn't typically come about as a result of an idealized rational process where everyone has equal input into the discussion. Rather, they typically come about as a result of a minority of dominant opinions swayed by political pressure, open to all kinds of social and epistemic injustice, and so on. So the institution of marriage, the conditions of being an immigrant, the conditions on voting, all of those, I think, provide examples of this kind. Okay. So now I'm going to relate what I've said so far to conceptual engineering more generally, precisely because questions surrounding conceptual engineering, questions surrounding concept and conceptual and semantic revision seem to play a particularly significant role in the literature on conceptual engineering. So here's a general characterization. Conceptual engineering is a form of theorizing that involves a proposal to revise a concept or the meaning of a term, typically on the grounds that this would constitute some kind of improvement. So you can see the notion of revision being central there. And standard examples include things like belief, gender, race, right, as in morally right, knowledge, truth, marriage, person, immigrant, and gene, and the list goes on. There's lots of them. Now, the first thing to note is that it's worth pointing out that the range of examples of conceptual engineering is very broad. There's a lot of things that count by people in the literature as cases of conceptual engineering, or concepts which are eligible for conceptual engineering. Now, if I'm right that concepts differ along a number of dimensions, including their direction of determination, their modal range, their temporal range, and that those properties have implications for a concept's eligibility for revision, then any metasemantic framework able to account for the range of examples claimed to be examples of conceptual engineering will have to be able to accommodate those differences. And I think the framework I've offered is in a good position to do that. It can acknowledge that there are different kinds of concepts with different kinds of properties that are eligible for revision in different kinds of ways. Some of them not at all, and some of them to some extent. But my suspicion is that a number of alternative frameworks don't fare quite so well in giving an account of all these possible examples. So, for example, Kaplan's worldly account of conceptual engineering maintains that in projects in conceptual engineering, what you're changing is the things in the world. You're changing the reference of the concepts and thereby changing the concepts. Now, while that might be appropriate for certain cases, like family, marriage, immigrant, and so on, it's clearly not going to work for things like natural kinds. It's not going to work for things like belief and truth, I think. Similarly, the temporal externalist account of conceptual engineering might be appropriate for some concepts, but it can't be right in general. It can't be right across the board. And a functionalist account of concepts might be appropriate, again, for some cases, but it can't be right in general. And I think that's okay, so long as it's clear what the scope of the relevant semantic claims is. So if you're just looking at specific kinds of concepts, maybe you've got a great functionalist account. But if you want to provide an overall metasemantic framework, I think attention needs to be paid to the different kinds of properties that the different concepts have. So that's what I've been trying to do today. Okay, so very quickly before I finish off, I want to say something about three of the main problems that arise in the literature on conceptual engineering. The first problem is the problem of topic continuity, which can be stated like this. How can a concept or term be about the same topic, both pre-revision and post-revision? That is, if the concept expressed by a term has changed as a result of conceptual engineering, and it expresses a different concept or meaning pre-revision from the concept or meaning it expresses post-revision, how can the term as used pre-revision and the term as used post-revision be about the same thing? And as I've argued previously, in a wide range of cases, standardly cited, I think what's revised is not a concept at all, it's just a conception. So revisionary analyses in such cases provide competing conceptions of a single phenomenon. The second problem for conceptual engineering that's more recently been raised is problem 2, the problem of concept pluralism, which can be stated like this. Does a term express the same concept, both pre-revision and post-revision? But again, given that in a wide range of cases standardly cited, what's revised is, I think, not a concept at all, but merely a conception, revisionary analyses in such cases provide competing conceptions associated with a single concept. And that means that just as the problem of topic continuity doesn't arise for those cases, the problem of concept pluralism doesn't arise for those cases either. Now, both of those problems, the problem of topic continuity and the problem of concept pluralism, raise concerns about the possibility of miscommunication. It's really miscommunication that people are worried about. How are we going to communicate if there's been this revision? So if a concept or term is revised, it's thought we run the risk of some people using the concept or term in a pre-revision way, while others are using it in a post-revision way, and hence the possibility of miscommunication arises from the possibility of revision. But note that the possibility of this kind of miscommunication already exists, even when meanings of concepts are stable across time. So it's nothing specifically to do with concept revision. The problem of miscommunication is there independently of whether we ever get to revise any concepts whatsoever. The possibility of miscommunication follows from an internalist theory of thought and language, and it follows from an externalist one. And that's because it's an empirical fact that people's beliefs about a single subject matter differ dramatically across a single linguistic community. And this difference in beliefs across individuals in the same linguistic community will, of course, affect the use of terms by those individuals in that linguistic community. That there are widespread differences in beliefs and linguistic usage is something that any theory of language has to accommodate. And as I said earlier, I don't think that fact is taken seriously enough. but it's a generic problem and it doesn't arise specifically for concept revision. So revisionary analyses that arise from conceptual engineering in such cases, I think, raise no new challenge. And this point also applies to a third problem that's been raised for conceptual engineering, which is problem 3, the problem of implementation. How can the revision of a concept or term be implemented? How do we go about making the relevant changes? So that's typically understood as the question, how can we change the way a concept or term is used in the community at large? But again, the problem arises anyway for both an internalist and an externalist theory of thought and language, because it's just the question of how we get individuals to have certain kinds of beliefs and not others, and to use words in certain ways and not others. But note that understood in this way, the implementation challenge occurs even on the assumption that concepts and meanings are stable. After all, since people's beliefs differ dramatically across a single community, and this affects their use of terms, there's already an ongoing project of teaching people how to think and how to use terms, even when concepts and meanings are not subject to revision. So again, revisionary analyses, I think, don't raise any new challenge here either. And this leads us to the following question, which is often raised. It has been raised, for example, by Max Deutsch in one of his recent papers. John Collins raised it just very recently. And this is the problem. It does look rather as if a wide range of cases standardly cited can be understood simply as cases of conceptual analysis, philosophical theorizing, scientific theorizing. And I think that's right. But not all of them can be understood in that way, precisely because of the special cases where you have an externally anchored concept. The special cases, I think, are different, not because they're new, it's not that we've never thought about this before, but because they do at least raise interesting questions about topic continuity, concept pluralism, and implementation. So with regard to topic continuity, a specific problem arises when the aim is to change the nature of the referent of a concept. With regard to concept pluralism, a specific problem arises when a concept is determined by our conceptions but externally anchored. And with regard to implementation, a specific problem arises when we need not only to change people's beliefs and linguistic practice, which we ordinarily are trying to do pretty much all the time, but also to persuade them that the referent of a concept or term ought to be different, and to change the world to match the proposed conception that is to take its place, with the result that the concept is revised in the process. Okay, so there's a lot more to be said, but I think that's enough for now. So that's it from me, and thanks for listening.